Thank you for joining me. Tonight's message I've entitled The Symbolic Sacrifice. I'll have to admit, I'm not the best gift giver, and I'm definitely not good at wrapping gifts. I can recall one Christmas not too long ago, I gave my sister a gift, and the wrapping paper was pieced together piece by piece like a jigsaw puzzle. My sister got a big kick out of that, and she laughed and laughed and laughed. What is it about gifts and giving? What is it about the desire to give? Is it the desire to make one happy with the thought behind the gift? Is it a way to show someone that they're thought about? A way to show someone you care? To give is to model the nature of God. For God is the great giver. What prompts the human spirit to ask, what can I give to God? What can I bring to God? What can I offer God? What is it about the human spirit that prompts a person to ask such questions? Does God hunger that I should bring him food? Does God thirst that I should bring him drink? Early on in the first few pages of the book of Genesis, we see offerings are brought to the Lord. Fruits of the soil and fat portions from some of the flock. Offerings are brought to the Lord. One person and his offering is looked with favor by the Lord, while the other person and his offering is not. Perhaps behind the gift and the giver is the intention on how to please the Lord. And if the Lord is pleased, then he may bring blessings. His favor is bestowed upon an individual. For many ancient religious beliefs, we see this desire manifested. The desire to please and appease the gods. Looking for ways to make the gods happy and keep them happy so that the byproduct of blessings would occur. Fruitfulness, abundance, whether it be in crops or family or perhaps even good weather. If the gods were happy, then the byproducts would be blessings. If the gods were unsatisfied or angry, it was believed that the opposite occurred, whether it be famine or destruction or bad weather or maybe an army invading. And so we see that this thought process for many was to appease the gods. This idea to curb emotions by gifts is a very ancient one. One part of relationship building is to discover one's likes and dislikes. As you are involved in a relationship, whether it be friend or romantic, you begin learning what someone's likes and dislikes are. The Israelites, here as we continue in our study in the book of Genesis, are learning what the Lord is looking for, what he desires from them as a covenant people. The Lord's treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God is looking for obedience from them, a covenant obedience. A covenant is a binding agreement between two parties. God, speaking to Israel, God says to Israel, now if you obey me, If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We see this covenant here, an agreement, a pact. What does that look like? Well, first we see that God speaks law. He gives the nation a law to adhere to. God speaks law. God gives and provides the law of honor or love. We see this mutual connection here between this honor and love. Honor or love God, and honor or love your neighbor. The covenantal people are to be a people committed to honor and to love. A law is fixed as a focal point. This was to unite the people together, a law that brings people together, a law given by God. And this is a fixed focal point for the people to maintain order and for them to be committed to this law, which would establish guideposts for honor and love. It is the law, the words of heaven brought down to earth, this commitment to honor and love. We read in Exodus 20, verse 22, the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites this, you have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven." From heaven to earth, the law of honor and love comes down to the people. This covenantal people who are in agreement, they have this covenant to uphold. They are in agreement to uphold the covenant. The people all responded together saying, "We will do everything the Lord has said." And Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. We see an agreement, this covenant. Both parties are in agreement. Obedience will make the people spiritually prosperous, a blessed nation. God gives the law. The law is given. It's what the Lord requires. A law honoring people who recognize love's responsibility to God and to neighbor. And God wishes to change the perspective of the Israelites, to remove past misconceptions, to frame a proper theology and worship of God. Again, we see in Exodus chapter 20, verse 22, where God says, "You have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. Other gods have no place in this new nation. They do not belong. They are not to be found. They are not to be crafted out of precious stones or precious metals. They're not to be used. They're not to be casted and carefully crafted. They're not to be used and looked to or created and fashioned as gods. They are not to be worshipped. For God has no equal." Again, we read in Exodus 20, verse 23, "Do not make any gods to be alongside me." God has no equal. And so God is addressing this previous idea of gods and goddesses. He's addressing these misconceptions and perceptions. He's addressing bad theology, idol worship, false practices. All of these need to be addressed and properly uprooted. The Israelites had spent hundreds of years living amongst the Egyptians with their plethora of gods and the Egyptian culture all around them. This is what they saw, was a worship of many gods. Culture began to be all around them and even influence them at times. Culture is where we get the word cult. Culture tends to culturize. Israel, a new nation, was to have a singular mindset, a focus of one nation under God. They were to be monotheistic, meaning one God, instead of polytheistic, meaning many gods. They were not to make for themselves gods. Again, we read in Exodus 20, verse 23, do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. Here we see God gives rules and regulations on what not to make. On what not to make. Don't make for yourself gods. God in turn establishes an avenue to utilize the creative spirit and drive to do and make something. That creativity. We have creativity in us. Maybe you like the arts. Maybe it's making paintings or drawings. Maybe it's making stuff with your hands. Maybe it's making music. You know, we have this creative spirit in us, but it needs to be properly channeled. And so God says, do not make this one thing. Instead, do this. Exodus 20, verse 24. Make an altar of earth for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and goats and your cattle. Here we see a make and a take. Make an altar of earth and take your offerings and bring them to the altar. Make an altar and take your offerings. The altar here that God is imploring the Israelites to make is an altar for sacrifice. You know, at the heart of the altar is a display of life and death. We see great symbolism here. It's symbolic here. It's not only symbolic, but it's being acted out. It's like a theater. You go to a play and you watch the people act it out. Here, the Israelites act out this display of life and death over and over and over. The living is given over to death. But the sacrifice that's made, when it's laid on the altar, is given to God. It's a picture and a reminder that is constantly before the people. This image of sacrifice. You know, it may seem strange to many of us who are removed from such an image of life and death, who try and avoid the thought, but not so for the Israelite. It was displayed front and center, life and death. Having something to give was and still is honored and respected and sacred. The sacrifice is part of worship. It's a gift to God. And God said, wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. There's also regulations we see for the altar. Exodus 20 verse 25, if you make an altar of stones for me, Do not build it with dress stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. You know, an altar is where you go to lay things down, including your tools, your labor. No work was to be done on God's altar. It was to be laid down. And God's altar was to be level, on common ground to be reached, not up high, so that there was great strides and effort to be made to reach it. Exodus 20, verse 26. Do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed. God's altar, an altar of earth, where sacrifices are made, where we go to lay our offerings down, an altar where labor ceases and rest is found, an altar for all to come to, that's close to the ground, on common ground. We see here that it's a foreshadow of things to come, a foreshadow of Christ's ultimate sacrifice, freely given to all who will accept him and welcome him in. Here we see one God, one altar, one sacrifice. Let us go to him and lay our burdens down. Well, I hope that this message has been a blessing to you. I thank you for tuning in and joining us. And I do hope and pray that you have a blessed rest of your week. If there's anything we can do for you, if we can be in prayer for you about a specific matter, feel free to write us. We'd love to uplift you in prayer. Again, I hope that you have a blessed rest of your week. And until next time, bye-bye.